So eventually, he started going to Tompkins Square Park. And we're all familiar with those pictures of Srila Prabhupada under a tree. They're black and white pictures, and with a little drum in his hand, didn't even have a mridanga. And just a group of ragtag hippie boys and girls around him. But this is actually where the Hare Krishna movement actually began. This is where things started to happen. Was in this little park, Tompkins Square Park, on the Lower East Side of New York City. Tompkins Square Park had a history of being kind of a place where different movements took off. There was a movement for allowing women to vote, and it took off from that park. There was other labor movements that took off, because that park was kind of open. You could get on your soapbox and speak out, and there was always a crowd, so you could get people to listen to you, and if you were clever enough or intelligent enough, you could move those people to do something. But Prabhupada just sat under a tree, and he was playing this little drum, and looking up. If he saw somebody interested, he would nod to them and gesture, come, come. He would invite them closer, closer. And if you look at those old videos, you just see what a variegated crowd of people. There's, because it's the Lower East Side of New York is a real ethnic kitchery. There's the people from Santo Domingo and Puerto Rico, from the people from Poland, there's the people from other Eastern European countries. There's just so many varieties of people there. So when you see these pictures, you can kind of see that ethnic melange. And you see even old, the old Russian ladies with their babushkas, their little handkerchiefs over their head, tied under their chin, and they're looking, and you see in many cases even their mouths are moving, and you see young children, and they're just transfixed. They're just watching this very unknown person, like, from another planet almost, because, if you look, you look around and everybody's dressed a little differently, but nobody looked like Srila Prabhupada looked. You couldn't tell if he was an old man, a young boy, or what he was. And I heard one of the speakers talking about how one day they saw Srila Prabhupada looking so simply effulgent, and they come bring a camera. But in this situation, where the mode of ignorance was prevalent, it was the predominating mode. Mode of passion, mode of goodness was somewhere in left field. It just wasn't too much part of the picture. So here was somebody who was beyond the mode of goodness. And he was just, a shining jewel, a shining gem. And so people were looking. And what was he doing? He was just playing a little drum and chanting. What was he chanting? Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Ram, Ram Ram, Hare Hare. And really nobody had heard this before. But they chanted with him. So this could only happen by a person who had received the direct blessings and empowerment of Chaitanya Mahaprabhu and had accepted his role as a servitor to the lotus feet of the Sankirtan movement. So gradually, these young people, these boys and girls, what Prabhupada always called us boys and girls, most of us were boys and girls at that point, late teens, early 20s. If somebody was 25, 26, 27, we considered them older at that time. So there was very few older people at that time. Satsarup, Kirtanananda, they were a little older, Hayagriva, a little older. But they came together and got that little storefront, began their weekly programs. Recently this summer, I sat with Radhanath-Swami and Janaki. And we sat for hours remembering beautiful early days of the beginning, the pre-Hare Krishna movement days. And for those of you who don't know, Janaki was the first initiated female disciple of Srila Prabhupada. So she was telling us how every night there was something, like on Tuesday there would be a music class, and he would teach how to play the kartals. He would teach how to play the mridanga. There would be a Sanskrit class on Wednesday, and he would teach them the basic Sanskrit sounds and vowels and how to pronounce. And then there would be the evening Bhagavad Gita class. And eventually there became the Sunday love feast. Srila Prabhupada was discussing with one of the early disciples, Kirtanananda, and Kirtanananda was telling him, well, in America, on Sundays, the whole family gets together, because during the week everybody's here and there, but on Sunday they get together. This was back in those days. Now they don't even do it, but they would get together and they'd have Sunday dinner. So he was suggesting we should have like the Sunday dinners in Prabhupada meeting. Yes, we should do this. And because of the mood of the time, the hippie mood, the hippie anthem was love and peace, brother. So he said we can call it a love feast. And that way people will be attracted to come. So that was the actual way we built the Sunday program for years. It was the Sunday love feast. And I think we could do with a little bit of that love nowadays. So Prabhupada agreed to that. So then there was the Sunday love feast. And in this way there started to be a little structure. There started to be a little organization. There started to be a little society for Krishna consciousness. Eventually, there was some talk about expansion. This is when there was like, a little handful of boys and girls. And nobody really liked the idea, because they thought, well, if we expand, that means Swamiji will go somewhere else. So we don't want him to go anywhere else. They had become so accustomed to and so attached to Srila Prabhupada, they couldn't imagine not seeing him every day. They couldn't imagine not being with him every day, not sitting down and eating with him every day. As you all know, initially he was even doing the cooking and he was serving them. And after they ate, they would get up and walk away, and he would clean up and wash the dishes and pots and pans. And eventually, fortunately, they, started assuming those responsibilities. But still, every day, they sat with him, and they ate with him, and they talked with him. So they couldn't imagine not doing that. But eventually, it came to pass that Mukunda and his wife Janaki, so she was the first initiated, and they were also the first couple that were married by Srila Prabhupada in the movement. In fact, Janaki was the first lady to wear a sari in the Hare Krishna movement. And that sari was the only sari in the movement for quite a while. So I was in the second marriage, and so I wore her sari for my marriage. And there was like at least 5 marriages that I know of that sari would be, the sari part. The men were not yet wearing dhotis. They would, in my case, because dhotis just quite hadn't caught on yet, So anyway, it was decided that they would travel to the West Coast, which is where they were from, and they would go to San Francisco and see about opening up a center in San Francisco. So on their way to San Francisco, they stopped off in Oregon. And Mukunda was from Oregon, Janaki was from Oregon. And another young couple was at that time still in Oregon, and that was myself and Shamsunder. And we were at the time on the top of a mountain. It was a very big mountain. It was like 12,500 feet. And we were employed by the government to look out for forest fires. So they came up, and it was a complete surprise because not too many people knew we were there on that mountain, and then to get up on the mountain, it was, quite difficult. So they told us of their plans, and the whole thing that I remember very clearly that evening, because you could say in one way it was the first meeting with Srila Prabhupada, in the effect that was the evening that Mukunda first presented us and showed us the Srimad Bhagavatam. So through correspondence, prior to that, through correspondence and letters, we didn't have email in those days, so we did something that was really quaint. We'd get a piece of paper and a pen and write a letter, put it in an envelope and get a stamp and send it, and then wait a few days and you'd get a letter, open it up. So we knew that he had met a person, a holy man from India. We knew that he got married, which was in itself fairly revolutionary for people from our culture at that point in time. And so now he's there in front of us, and he's also told us something else that was interesting, that they'd changed their names. Formerly they had been Jan and Mike, and now Mukunda mentioned that their names are now Janaki and Mukunda. And Janaki prepared prasadam. That was the first prasadam that we had ever honored. And she made, I remember she was rolling out these little dough balls and we had a wood stove, she was putting them on the wood fire, and they were like blowing up. And I just remember looking at, what is this? What is it? Just, like suddenly these little flat things became like balloons. And it was, really seemed very exotic. And so that was the first prasadam. So after prasadam, of course we didn't understand prasadam, but vegetarian. It was vegetarian, and it was our first time for a full vegetarian meal. And then he said, now I want to show you the real treasure. So what is this? And he brought out the books. And it was just so otherworldly, these books, because nowadays you have books on any topic, all the Vedantas, this, Puranas and that, and it's, profusely available at any bookstore, at any internet. But in those days, there was basically a few translations, Mayavadi translations of Bhagavad Gita. There was the Tibetan Book of the Dead that all the hippies, that was the book we read. We thought that was the book, the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that we should read, and did read, and couldn't understand because it didn't make any sense. And then there was another book called the I Ching, and many of us grew up. If we had some dilemma, if we wanted to know what we should do, we'd go throw the I Ching, and we'd look and see what we should do through that method. So these were the three books, Mayavadi, Bhagavad Gita, Tibetan Book of the Dead, and the I Ching, and that was to the extent of our spiritual books in those days. So these were something quite different, and immediately you could feel the authenticity that was held between the covers of this book. But even the cover itself was extraordinary, to see these little bubbles, and in each little bubble there was a blue person with 4 arms. And on the biggest bubble there was a blue person with 4 arms lying on a big snake with a flower coming out of his stomach with a fellow with 4 heads. So I'm looking at this. And again, this is where being open-minded, the hippies were open-minded. So I'm looking at this, I say, what is this? And Mukunda very said, this is God. So right away, immediately, that was something I could, because it made sense that God had to be quite unlike we were. Because all of the hippie philosophy was really pushing, we're all God. It's either there's no God or we're all God. That was kind of the way it was being presented in the hippie sampradaya. So either no God or we're all God. So I didn't quite accept the no God because there was too many unexplained things. But when I was thinking if I was God, that was pretty sad, and I saw quite a few other sad gods. So I couldn't accept that. So here was something that was completely unlike anything else I'd ever been exposed to, and it looked so godly. I was happy with this. Okay, this is God. And inside, you know, there was this trend, the Sanskrit, and I can just kind of remember one phrase that kept coming up, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Because coming from the West, we were just saying God. We didn't, you know, have such an eloquent way of describing the Supreme Lord, the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So while I couldn't understand any of it at that point, from that, just simply touching the Bhagavatam and looking at the cover, I actually got some attraction. And then Mukunda said to us, we are going to San Francisco to begin a temple. And he said, I'd like you to come with us. So I asked a very profound question. I asked him, what is a temple? And because I wasn't sure what I just was trying to fit all this in. And he gave a very profound answer. He said, it is a storefront painted white. So we kind of thought, okay, we could handle that. But the thing was, we had this contract with the government that we had to stay on that mountain until the first snowfall. So we said, okay, well, you know, as soon as the snow falls, we'll be down there. We'll certainly come and help you. And we all went to bed that night. This was like just it maybe is about as big as this stage, if even this big. Probably the stage is bigger than that little cabin was. There was no facility, just a wood stove that provided heat and for cooking. If you wanted to do anything else, you went outside, found a tree, and there was a little stream, and that was it. So the next morning, responding to the call of nature, I opened the door, and I couldn't believe my eyes. There was snow. And I looked in the ground, I could see the footprints, I could see that a mountain lion had walked by, I could see other animals' feet, and I was like, but there was snow. It meant we could leave. So I remember we had to communicate with the mission, the people at the bottom of the mountain, who were our bosses, had these little high-powered CB radio things, so I had to wait till 9 o'clock when they'd be in their office so I could let them know, we're gonna pack up and move out. And they said, what are you talking about? We said, yeah, we're leaving, there's snow. And the thing was, because the mountain was so tall, it had only snowed up on the top of the mountain. There was some snow cloud came by. So there was just a little snow on the top of the mountain. There wasn't snow anywhere else, actually. So they said, well, look, that snow's going to be gone tomorrow. And I'm looking at the contract, and it didn't say the snow had to stay. It just said it had to snow. So, we left. And we packed everything up into we had a little car, we had a little trailer, we put everything we owned in it, and Mukunda, Janaki, and at that time, their sister, Joan, who later became Jamuna, was with them. So the three of them and the two of us and we had some pets, cats, dogs, some, other family members, the cat and the dog, they came with us, and we all headed for California and headed for San Francisco. When we arrived in San Francisco, you could say we didn't know whether to go right or left. I had lived previously in San Francisco, and Shamsundar had lived previously in San Francisco. So, we had an idea of the town, But where were we? Now we had a mission. Before we were just aimless, sense-gratifying hippies. Now we had a mission, so where should we go, right or left? And we were driving around just looking for a place to live, looking for a sign that would say for rent. And I saw one little street. It was a little street, and it said, Lucky Alley. I said, look, let's go down that street. So we went down Lucky Alley, just a small street, small Rasta. At the very end, there was just the house before the last house on the left in the window, for rent. So we ran to the corner, because in those days, no cell phone, no mobile phone. So they had little phone boxes on the corner. We ran there and put our dime in and called the landlord, and we want to rent the place, okay. So now we had a place to stay. And immediately from the next day on, Mukunda and Shamsundar, that time was Sam, they started roaming the city looking to find a suitable storefront. And eventually they were able to find that storefront, and that was 518 Frederick Street, which was to become the second ISKCON center. In those days, Prabhupada would instruct the temple to make a sign, Radha Krishna Temple. So we didn't know, well, what is this Radha Krishna Temple, but we're supposed to have, Mukunda said we had to have this sign, so we had the sign. So then we asked, I remember when Prabhupada came, somebody asked him, what does this mean, Radha Krishna? Who's Radha? Krishna we figured out, that's God, but Radha. So Srila Prabhupada, looking at his audience, could understand that Radharani was a topic that was kind of way beyond our comprehension at that point. So he spoke in a way that we could understand. And he said very simply, Radharani is Krishna's girlfriend. So that was a really wonderful answer, because, right away the hippies were, we were all hippies, so that was good. God had a girlfriend. He was, he was a real person, Prabhupada was saying he was a person, so now we're convinced he's a real person. So on this little storefront in San Francisco, though, we were getting it ready, we were painting it white. We still had not seen, except for the cover of the Bhagavatam, we hadn't seen any pictures of Krishna yet. So we just kind of conceptually knew he was blue, he had a peacock feather, he played a flute, and there were sometimes some cows. It was just the things we heard. And while we were preparing the storefront, one young man came up, he goes, what are you doing? And we told him we're making a temple for Krishna. And he goes, oh, so I've just come back from India and I'm an artist, so I'll make you a picture. So since we didn't have anything on the wall, we were very happy to accept his offer. And he painted, it was a fairly large picture, maybe about 4 feet by 4 feet, but it was a picture of Vishnu. So again, we had the blue person with the 4 arms. But then because he was like, hippie, he wasn't, knowing so much about parampara and, sticking to the Vedas, he did a little artistic rendition, we can say poetic license. So he had Vishnu flying out of a volcano. And we had no idea that that was unusual, so we put that picture up on the wall, And that was actually, so that was the only picture we had when Prabhupada first came. And then Shamsundar had previously been in Morocco, so he had this Moroccan, it was a prayer mat for when the Muslims go do their prayer. This was a prayer mat. So he had that prayer mat, and we put that behind the little platform, because we didn't know the word Vyasa sign hadn't entered our vocabulary yet. So we just had like a little platform that would, a little raised platform for Swamiji to sit on, and we put that behind it. So there was a picture of Vishnu flying out of the volcano with the Muslim prayer mat. And then somebody suggested he should have a cushion to sit on. So, hippies usually did not have any money. And if we had money, we tried not to spend it. You know, we wanted to get whatever we could get for nothing. And so we just went out in the street and we found some discarded sofa, and we took the cushion from the sofa and, you know, put that down for Prabhupada to sit on. And I'm mentioning this just, you know, to say that our efforts were definitely very clumsy. But there was some sincerity. There was a definite desire to, we hadn't even met him, but there's some spark had entered our heart that we wanted to meet him and we wanted to do something for him. And he could definitely see all the imperfections. And it was pointed out by Jananiwas and his brother how meticulous he was here in Sridham Mayapur. Any small little detail, and I was here in the beginning, so I can say any small little detail. There was no small little detail. It was all a big deal. You didn't leave a light bulb on. You didn't leave the fan on. You didn't waste a paisa, literally speaking. I don't even think we have paisas anymore. Is there paisas anymore? Yeah, you know, like you didn't do, you know, like charana, you didn't misspend even 4 paisa. So careful. But in the initial stage, while he was trying to get, you know, this ship up and running, there was a great latitude of tolerance. Because how could you explain to such deeply ignorant people, you know, some of the basic truths? So you first had to get them to a condition where they can understand what they were being told. So by the time the Mayapur project came, at least we were at that level where we could understand. And if we didn't get it and we made some mistake, then now it was okay, change, you know. But in the beginning, just he would, you know, let things ride, and then when he could sense that the person might be able to hopefully receive it, he would say, by the way, you know, don't do this or you should do that. When we first got Lord Jagannath, he told us to get a plates for him. He had to tell us, and then knowing how our mentality was, he says, new ones. He says, they must never have been eaten from. He had to tell us to get new plates for the, I mean, none of you would ever think of giving the deity a used plate. But at that point in time, we probably would have done it. So he had to tell us to make sure that they were new plates, not used before. So he was with very, very raw material. We were extremely raw material. That's what he was working with. And there wasn't, you know, now if you come into the temple, everything is already in place. You know, it's all there. It's all happening. It's, you know, the protocol, the standards are already established. And you've got the examples, you've got the devotees who are already practicing to show you what to do or what not to do or how to do it. But since we were the beginning in the first wave, we didn't have that. We only had Srila Prabhupada. He had to show, when Janaki got married, he had to show her how to put on a sari. There was no one else to do it. So, an extreme amount of tolerance was there. But the tolerance wasn't out of some indifference. It was out of a desire to establish the order of his guru. And in order to do that, he had to, he told us that in the beginning, he was actually, when he saw how degraded it was, he was ready to accept, okay, maybe these people are going to continue eating meat and drinking alcohol. And he was ready to go with it as long as they'd at least chant Hare Krishna. He was actually surprised when he saw how willing we were to give up the meat eating. In fact, when you read in his diary, he mentions in the early days of New York when he was so alone, oh, tonight three people came, or tonight 4 people came to listen. And afterward they took prasadam. And then he goes, and they liked it. They seemed to like it. So he was, very amazed that, they're taking prasadam and they're chanting. So it was all about encouraging people to take that first step and go from there. And we have taken, all of us here have taken that first step, and hopefully a few more by now. And somebody mentioned yesterday about sitting on our laurels, meaning because we have all this now, we don't have anything else to do. But as he mentioned, while there may be 3,500 of us here, there's like about 35 billion people out there that don't have it. So this is a symptom of the sadhu, that he is not content to be content when there's others who are suffering. And Srila Prabhupada, at an age when most people would, in America we say, sit back on your rocking chair, I mean you retire, you don't have anything else to do anymore, you just get in your rocking chair and, watch life go by. That's when he began his life mission. So most of us now who were there in the beginning, we're around that same point in time and age when Srila Prabhupada began his life mission. It means, sometimes I hear some God brothers and God sisters talk about retiring, and I'm thinking, well, retire from what? Now's the time to get started. So, I think we're supposed to end at 1 o'clock, is that right? Pardon? Okay. I can speak, if you like, a little bit about the scene in San Francisco at that time. But finally, we were anticipating, we got that storefront, but we were anticipating getting the arrival of Swamiji to San Francisco. So even before we had the storefront, we were very ambitious about bringing attention to his imminent arrival to the people of San Francisco. And we made these flyers, and the flyers had the mantra on it, and it said, Swamiji is coming. And then it said the mantra. There was no date, there was no address, because we didn't have one. But we were passing these flyers out, and we were also carrying one with us because we were still ourselves trying to learn the mantra and get all the words in the right order. So we would go up to people, because we were told this, that we should go out and get people to chant this mantra. So we would go up to totally unknown people and give them the flyer, and then please chant this mantra, and then we'd look at it to make sure we were saying it right, and ask them to chant. And then after a little time, we got 518 Frederick Street, so now we had an address. So the next flyer said, coming, Swamiji is coming to 518 Frederick Street. No date, but we had an address. And then finally, we had the address, the date. So this was really exciting, And not only that, we had simultaneously made plans for this. You've heard about the mantra rock dance, where our friends from the rock and roll industry would come together and do a performance, a benefit performance, to help the new temple get going. So the third flyer it gave the address of the temple and the date of Prabhupada's arrival, and invited people, if they wanted to come to the airport, to meet and to greet him. So on the day of his arrival, at the airport, there was maybe about 50 persons. You could say a motley crew, a very mixed crew. In those days, the reporters, they would wear like suit and tie, so there were some suit and tie reporters. And I remember one, he even had like a hat on. And they had very big cameras with very big flash bulbs. This was like 67, January 67. And they were standing there. And Allen Ginsberg, who was a really degenerate, he was like this hippie beatnik poet. Before the hippies, there were people called beatniks. And then the beatniks morphed into hippies. So he was like a hybrid of both of those. And even myself, I was like first part of with the beatnik people. And then I remember I met a person, I said, oh, what are you? And he goes, I'm a hippie. What? What are you? What is that? A hippie. So, then the hippies took over. So he was there. And he was like one of the few people who had been to India and had chanted Hare Krishna. And he knew, he played a harmonium. And so there was a little charisma, associated with him. And he had some books with his poetry, so-called, printed. And then there was just people who came out of curiosity. Who is this Swami who's coming? And then there was the few people that had started trickling in when they saw us working on the storefront. And then there was the New York boys who had come to make sure that Swami wasn't captured by the Wild West San Francisco people. And so all in all, maybe about 50 persons. And we're just waiting. In those days, no restrictions at the airport. Just could, go in. You could go on the plane if you wanted, even if you weren't flying. So we're all there. I'm there with my dog, and planes coming down. And I started thinking, it was quite we had to get that ticket. For us, it was, quite costly. We got some of our friends from the rock and roll industry. They had contributed to the ticket. But, this is a Swami. And we didn't actually understand what a Swami was. And for us, it was something kind of unworldly, more like a magician, maybe. So I was thinking, we probably didn't even need to get this ticket. He could have just, appeared here. And so I was thinking, why did we even bother? It was so much trouble getting this ticket. We should have just, he could have just come here, landed here. And we also thought, we hadn't really asked Mukunda so much details, there was no pictures. But many of us had an idea in our mind that he was going to be larger than life. So when the plane finally came down and we're, this person came off waiting, and he was like the last one out. But when he came out, all of a sudden, it was like all the flash bulbs were going off in your eyes, and you couldn't quite see him clearly. And on top of that, some of us, myself included, somehow fell down on the floor. And we weren't introduced to obeisances yet, so it wasn't like we were doing our obeisances. Somehow we were on the floor. And, when you get a light bulb in your face or you stare at the sun, you know how it is, you're trying to get your vision back. So we're on the floor trying to get the vision back, and suddenly I'm seeing right in front of me is just this incredibly bright person. And then I realized it wasn't light bulbs, it was this person. And he was, you can't say walking by, but we have to use the term gliding. Many people will say this when they express to you how Srila Prabhupada walked, that he was gliding by. And I'm looking up, he was not so big. Or was he big? We couldn't tell, but he didn't seem so big. And he had on these white shoes, white plastic shoes. I'd never seen anything like that before, like white plastic shoes. Nowadays, plastic is everywhere. In those days, not so much plastic was around, so these white plastic shoes. And he's walking by with his head held erect, and then right behind him was my dog, following him. And I remember thinking, yeah, my dog is smarter than I am. He's like on his feet following him, so I was like getting up, and it was like being in a dream, and everybody was kind of getting up. And usually if somebody comes for the first time to a certain place, you have somebody there to come this way. But we didn't do that. We all just started following him. And, and then Mukunda appeared on the scene. Mukunda was always a little bit more cool-headed and practical about things, and started bringing him out towards the car. But, still Prabhupada was leading the pack. He was leading the charge. You can see this, and there's a little clip, a little video clip, and you can actually see Ralph, that's the dog, and the rest of us kind of like following along, a little wave following along. Prabhupada gets to the car and he goes off. And then we all meet back in the little storefront. So when you get into this, now suddenly the storefront, at one point, it seemed huge because just a few of us would be in there painting it and getting it ready. So I thought the place seemed huge, but actually now we all got back there, it was packed. It was just body to body. And every one of those bodies was like a very interesting body because the hippies were very colorful. And just like in the age of Kali begins with a black man dressed up like a king, well, the hippies used to dress up like different personalities, whoever they wanted to be. Some people like to dress up like Jesus Christ, or Napoleon Bonaparte, or whatever, or some Indian chief. So you had a room full of, colorful personalities. And on top of that, the hippies would all live in these big communes, and taking a daily bath was not necessarily part of their lifestyle. But putting on a lot of scented oils was, and the predominating scent was patchouli. So I mean, this patchouli oil is like very dense, heavy smell to it. It can be almost nauseating. So the room was just filled with, and then a lot of them had little sticks of incense because, and flowers in their hand and in their hair. And there was all kinds of hair, lots of hair. And some people didn't have very many clothes on at all. So that room was very colorful, very fragrant, very, very packed. And Prabhupada was in the room. He came in, he sat on the little platform. And of course, at that time, I hadn't been to a Kumbh Mela. So if I'd been to a Kumbh Mela, this room would not have looked so strange. But, I was thinking, looking at, like, he must think this is really strange. But actually, I hadn't been to India, and I hadn't seen how strange India could be either. So he picked up the kartals and he began a kirtan. And everybody joined in, everybody was chanting. And then he spoke very briefly. It was mentioned by one of the Prabhus earlier that in general we don't remember the details of the lecture in those early days. It was more about Prabhupada, his presence, and the effect it had on us. But I do remember part of that lecture because he's addressing this room full of hippies. And the whole hippie movement was based upon, as I mentioned earlier, peace and love. The love was a big thing. And the hippies would have these weekly events called love-ins. And they'd all just pack into the park, either in, or Tompkins Square Park in New York and Golden Gate Park in San Francisco, and just merge together. And it was just called a love-in. And, what you did, who knows? Mostly they got stoned and not with rocks. But Prabhupada's addressing this group of people who are, professing love in the world. And the first thing he said was really, he just said it very, very accurately. He didn't, pound it out. He just said, there is no love in the material world. So that could have been a slightly inflammatory statement for the mindset of the audience he was speaking to. But he proceeded to describe the nature of authentic love, of true love, coming from the true lover, Lord Krishna. And it was so beautiful, and it was so loving. And Srila Prabhupada was speaking in such a profound way, and at the same time, coming from him was a feeling of love that everyone in that room was feeling personally touched by Srila Prabhupada's mood. And I feel that for those of us who stayed with him from that time, that as he was speaking to us in this very wonderful way, we were falling in love with Srila Prabhupada. And he was giving this mood of love without condition. It was a mood, even the love of our parents was not so generous. So after speaking, everybody it was kind of like they were mystified in a wonderful way. And then Prabhupada started another kirtan, and then everybody just that next kirtan was just everybody went wild, just joining in, just without abandon, just joining in very enthusiastically and chanting. And then Prabhupada brought the kirtan to a halt, and then he said, distribute prasadam. And in those days, it just would be a tray of fruit cut up into pieces and coming from his lotus hand. And everybody was coming forward to get that wonderful little piece of fruit offered by Srila Prabhupada. And just no matter how little or big it was, just that little piece of fruit was so delicious and so satisfying. And we felt so blessed to have that wonderful piece of fruit, that wonderful mercy from his lotus hand. He gave one instruction before retiring. He looked and he said, feed them. So I understood from the New York devotees that he was had been cooking for the devotees, and now the devotees were doing the cooking, and that every day there was be a lunch program, a lunch prasadam, and it was open for anybody who would come in. You didn't have to be a member to come in and take this. So I was interested to do that. So that was my first service for Srila Prabhupada, was the lunch prasadam program, which meant you also had to get the funds to get the lunch prasadam together, or at least get people to make the donations, and that was part of it. I also had to get a stove. We had a little tiny stove, but eventually I was able to secure an actual, authentic, like restaurant-sized stove. There was one rock and roll group called Grateful Dead. Srila Prabhupada was living in the same building, but above. There was an apartment above where the temple was, and had a window overlooking the street. He had a simple, it was like what you call railroad apartment. You walked in, and there would just be one room kind of divided. There was a little kitchen, there was a little room, and that room was his living room and the room where he slept. There was a bathroom. And the only furniture was his metal trunk that he would use as a desk. And so from that little room, which is his living quarters, his office, where he was directing things. And downstairs we were having Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings there would be an evening class by Swamiji, and then every morning we'd have Mangal Arti. Mangal Arti in those days began at 7 o'clock. And we thought that was quite early. But Srila Prabhupada would come down and he'd sing the Shamsara prayers, and then we'd have a Srimad Bhagavatam class, a little discussion, and then there'd be breakfast prasadam, and then whatever business we had to do throughout the day. So that was the initial how we would spend our time. And eventually it was discussed how Lord Chaitanya sent his men out on the street performing Harinam. So, we were having the discussion. The discussion was there to build up our courage, like, let's go out on the street and do this. So eventually the first Harinam party happened, and they went down to, there was one place where like all the trolley, it was like a meeting place. And one of the streets was Union Street. Anyway, the streets came together. There was a lot of foot traffic, and set up Vishnu Janan, Tamal Krishna, Jamuna, so many at Uddhava, and quite a few of the early devotees were there, and sat down and performed the first Harinam in the public. And Tamal Krishna had at that time he was still Bhakta Tam, but he had a conch shell. And we had, in those days, Back to Godhead magazines were just like photocopies, only it was called mimeograph, and then we'd staple them together. And we'd try to get 25 cents a quarter. If somebody would give us 25 cents, we'd take 5 cents or even a dime. So we were doing the Harinam, And then, Tom tried to distribute these magazines, and he had the conch shell, and he'd give one out. I mean, calling it a magazine was quite generous. It was, what it was. But he had the conch shell out, so he was trying to distribute and just say, put something in the conch shell. So people did it. So at the end of that day, we went home and back to the temple, and there was something like $6.35, something, or whatever it was. It wasn't a whole lot. But, I think it was less than that. It was maybe $4.65, quite, But it was like, it dawned on us that actually, we could actually collect money by book, by distributing in this way. And at that point in time, the few brahmacharis we had were having job. I guess he's going to tell me I have to quit here. So the boys had jobs. They were actually, the brahmacharis went out and they'd have jobs, and they would give their paycheck toward the maintenance of the temple. And so when Bhakta Tom, who became Tamal Krishna, saw that you could actually...
I am the greatest joined up the creation.
What is the word? So they were working outside, and when they saw, when he saw that we could actually sell this transcendental literature and get some donations, he wrote to Srila Prabhupada, and Prabhupada, can we, maybe we can quit these jobs now and we'll be able to support ourselves like that. And Prabhupada gave his blessings, and yes, do like that. So this was also the beginning of a very humble beginning of transcendental book distribution. Harinam began, book distribution began in a very humble way. But so that's a little bit, that's kind of some historical background of early days and beginning of ISKCON. It's now 1:30, so